Happy Wednesday. How's it going, everybody?
Good.
It's good to be here.
Likewise. Yeah. So today we have Kenten Danas from Astronomer, the company that's behind Airflow. So this will be a fun chat. Also brought on Matt Housley, my compatriot over here at Ternary Data. He's a big Airflow fan, so figured we'll has a lot to contribute to this conversation. So let's get started. Cool. Thanks for joining us, Kenten.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. For people who don't know who you are, do you want to just give a quick intro?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm Kenten. I'm a field engineer at Astronomer. So I work with our sales teams on sort of pre-sales technical help, and I also do a lot of Airflow related content. So I run a lot of our webinars, help folks adopt Airflow, write our Airflow guides, and maintain that site, and lots of fun stuff like that.
That's a lot of work. That's awesome. Yeah, and Matt, what are your thoughts on Airflow? I mean, you've been using Airflow for a while.
Yeah. So I've been using it since 2017, as we were just talking about before the show. I've had the experience of having Airflow go down on Thanksgiving Day. The nice thing about these managed services like Astronomer is that they're designed to solve a lot of the problems that I had back in the old days, just running Airflow on a single server. So, and we'll come back to that later. One thing I'd like to talk about a little bit later is some of the major, kind of architectural issues with Airflow, like dependency management, and some of the things that are happening with the code base and with Astronomer specifically to fix those problems. So, which I think you have a lot to say on that, Kenten.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. But let's back up here. I mean,
Yeah.
For the audience that doesn't know what Airflow is, can you quickly give an overview, Kenten?
Yeah, definitely. So Airflow is a tool for programmatically authoring, scheduling, monitoring your data pipelines. So it's an open source tool. It was developed at Airbnb and then later open sourced. It's now an Apache Software Foundation project. So one of the kind of core tenets of Airflow that sets it apart from other orchestration tools is that all of your pipelines are written as Python code. So that allows you to kind of use basic, software development best practices with your data pipelines as well. That's kind of one of the main benefits.
Interesting. So, I mean, Airflow's been around for a while, right? I mean, Matt was using it back in the old days and pulling his hair out as a result when he had to manage it himself. What's that?
I'm still using it, though.
You still use it because you love it so much.
Still a great product.
But the Astronomer is an interesting one. I mean, that had come on the scene, I think, a few years ago. I mean, walk me through, like, why would you want to manage your own Airflow? Like, why don't you just spin it up on a server and let it do its thing, or run it on your laptop or on Kubernetes or something?
Yeah, for sure. I was saying before the show that prior to working at Astronomer, I actually worked as a data engineering consultant, and I had run Airflow myself, kind of with a client. We built it from the ground up. And I would say the short answer to that question, why wouldn't you do that, is it's really hard. There's a lot of different moving pieces. And while Airflow itself, I think, is pretty easy to learn from a data engineering standpoint, if you know a little bit of Python especially, getting it up to where it's running in production and reliable and scalable, and you have role-based access control and authentication management and logging and monitoring and all of that stuff, like doing all of that yourself is really hard. And then if something breaks, it's all on you, and you're doing a lot of work that has already been done for you in some cases. So like that's one of Astronomer's main goals is we take care of all of that. You just have the platform. You can work directly with your data and your DAGs. You don't have to worry about all of that other stuff. And you have someone to call when something goes wrong, and you have help, kind of both on the Airflow side and on the monitoring side. So yeah, I think that drives a lot of teams, into using sort of more of a managed service.
And one thing I tell our clients is that Airflow is a fantastic tool, but if you're running your data pipelines there, then that's the bottleneck over your SLA, right? You can't, anytime Airflow goes down, all your data pipelines go down. It doesn't matter how reliable your other systems are.
Yeah.
That's interesting. But I mean, it seems like there's quite a few managed offerings right now on the various clouds. I mean, you got Cloud Composer on Google, and AWS is its own managed workflows. I mean, why why would somebody like pick Astronomer over just using one of the the big cloud solutions?
Yeah, I think solutions like Google Cloud Composer or MWA at AWS we often refer to them as good dial tone services. So if you want to just spin up Airflow and have it there, that's great. You can do that. You're not going to get the same sort of full-fledged support as you would with Astronomer. And one of the biggest differences is that Astronomer is actually driving the open source Airflow project as well, right? We employ most of the Airflow PMC, a lot of the committers. We're managing the releases for open source Airflow and developing a lot of those features, often in conjunction with what we're hearing from our customers. So if you're using a product like MWA or GCC, you're not going to have access to all of the Airflow features that you would with Astronomer, or especially like newer versions. They're often more behind on that support. You're also not going to have any help if something goes wrong. So if you're using MWAA and you have a problem either with Airflow or the MWAA instance itself, you're just going through basic AWS support, which AWS does a lot of things really, really well. Airflow isn't the main piece of that, right? So I think you're going to struggle in those sort of channels more. And we get a lot of customers who have run into that. They use things for a while and it works great. And then they hit a point where they need some help and they don't have it. So Astronomer is really only focused on Airflow while those other companies are off doing basically everything.
Yeah, and I can say some specific things about Cloud Composer because I use it all the time. And I think in many respects, it is a great product if you're using Google services. Like they've done a very good job of integrating it with Google services, but we ran into an issue this week where we were trying to deploy Snowflake with Cloud Composer. It's completely impossible. Like it's just not going to happen. It's for a whole variety of reasons anyway.
Yeah, we hear that a lot for various reasons. Integrations outside of, I think MWA is the same. If you have a single AWS account and all of your data services are in that AWS account, you're probably fine. Again, unless you need more help with Airflow or want the newest versions. But anytime you're trying to kind of expand out of that, it's going to be a harder time.
You brought up an interesting point, though, right? Like a lot of the core contributors, for Airflow are working with Astronomer. I mean, how much are the clouds themselves contributing back to the Airflow project as well?
Yeah, so to my knowledge from the AWS side, I don't think they have made any commits to Airflow. At least that was true as of a couple of months ago. If it's changed, I would apologize to them, but they're not actively contributing. I think Composer has had more of an influence. On the open source project, but again, they don't have the PMC members and nearly as many committers. So
yeah, and my impression with GCC is that they've done a really good job of building integrations for things like BigQuery. So for any kind of GCP product, they put in commits. But I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, I haven't seen a lot of other activity, but maybe they've done other things too.
Yeah, I don't have just myself, I'm not sure how much they've contributed more to like the core of Airflow. You are right that Google's provider package is very well built out. There's a lot of different operators and hooks and stuff available, which is great. And like, that's great work that the Google team has contributed to. I think it helps the community out a lot. But yeah, in terms of core Airflow functionality and kind of continuing to drive the Airflow project forward, most of that is coming from Astronomer.
Pause there. There's a painter about to start, so.
Oh, got it. Okay. Maybe
yesterday was really odd.
Yeah. Do you have next question, Joe, or we can start talking about some of the new things happening with latest versions of Airflow that just came out a couple weeks ago?
Go for it.
Yeah. So one of the consistent problems, again, I continue to use Airflow. I think it's a fantastic product. I've also run into a lot of the main issues that engineers will have if they try to stand up their own or use something like Cloud Composer. And so one of the headaches with Airflow is dependency management. And this is part of the problem with Cloud Composer. What Google tries to do is put in every possible Google service as a dependency. And therefore, if you try to add anything else, it will break. Like it's almost already broken, right? It's like right on the edge of being broken. If you blow on it, it falls over. It's fine if you don't touch any dependencies, but if you want to add a library, it just breaks. And so my understanding is that the latest release of Airflow is meant to fix some of these problems. And then also that Astronomer is doing some things to try to improve the situation with dependency management.
Yeah, I think dependency management is sort of an unfortunate downside that comes along with being a Python-based tool, right? It's sort of a Python problem first, and unfortunately Airflow inherits that. We have had, people come to us from, GCC specifically that have struggled more because of the additional constraints that Google has put in that project, which just takes something that's already really tricky and makes it even harder, right? From an astronomer perspective, one thing that we do that I think makes that easier in general is not have all of those additional packages. So you have a lot more control over what you're installing in the environment. There are still, issues you can run into where if you have a package that conflicts with something that's in the core of Airflow, there's not much we can do about that either. The workarounds that, we typically recommend for something like that are, using the Kubernetes pod operator and kind of imagifying everything in your task. So then you don't have to worry about it at all, right? Like your task is its own little environment. You can install whatever you want in it and you don't have to worry about, what's going on in the rest of it, Airflow. And Astronomer makes, using those operators and different executors and all of that stuff really easy. So we have all of those options available. Yeah, that's typically the route that I go when recommending how folks manage those. Another thing is, sometimes folks will use that as an excuse to have multiple Airflow deployments. So that's, again, something that the Astronomer platform makes really easy, is spinning Airflows up and down, which I feel like sounds really trivial until you have to actually do it yourself. And then you're like, oh, wait, this is actually really hard. I have to go provision all this extra infrastructure and stuff. So one of the, most basic features of the platform is being able to just spin up an environment in a couple of clicks. And sometimes we will have folks, split out DAGs into separate Airflows to kind of manage those dependencies if they have things that are conflicting. So that's kind of another side that Astronomer would make that easier.
Yeah, I mean, in truth, even with clients on Cloud Composer, I generally tell them never to do in-place upgrades. You guys might disagree, but I'm basically like, don't touch it. Just if it's running, leave it alone and start a new one with a new version and then migrate everything. And the nice thing is that even on Cloud Composer, it's fairly easy to just click and spin up a new one. I know the story is even better with you guys because it is a more focused product, but yeah, just create a new one and then start migrating everything over to the next version. So.
Yeah, it's always nice to have that option available to you. I would say I've seen in-place upgrades happen successfully in a lot of cases, but it's good to have sort of that backup if for some reason something goes wrong and you need to roll back. That's easier.
Yeah, and you were talking about your experience as a consultant deploying Airflow, and some things I've dealt with in terms of on-prem infrastructure, Hadoop, and then coming to AWS and GCP and suddenly being able to click a button and just spin up a Hadoop cluster or an Airflow environment. It was such a huge revelation, right? And yeah, that capability of a managed service, plus the fact that it's going to be secure if you treat it correctly, it just makes such a huge difference.
Yeah, I think I said this before the show started, but after I came to Astronomer and sort of saw what the product did, I was like, if I had known about this when I was consulting, it would have saved me 6 months of my life. Actually, it's surprisingly difficult to do.
Interesting. I actually got a question here from Guy Thompson on YouTube. He and it's related to consulting. So it's slightly off the path of talking directly about Astronomer, but he asks, what's it like going from data engineering consulting to working for Astronomer? How did that move happen? And what's your day-to-day like now?
Yeah, that's a great question. So from kind of how that move happened, because I was working on a team to implement Airflow, that's kind of how I learned about Astronomer, even though this was back in 2019, Astronomer was still sort of pretty central in the Airflow story. So I got connected to them in that way. And then, it ended up just sort of naturally working out that they had this position open. In terms of the transition from, consulting, I actually found it to be pretty natural. I'm in sort of a customer facing role right now. I still do a lot of, trainings and webinars and working with potential customers on, their architecture and how they can either migrate to Airflow or migrate to, if they're already using Airflow, just migrate to Astronomer. So I think that was a pretty natural transition for me from consulting. And my day-to-day now is, again, sort of half and half split. I work on our field engineering team. So that's working with customers, as they're coming into Astronomer to, again, help them adopt either Airflow, Astronomer, or both. And then my other half is doing sort of content. I always think of it as like Airflow evangelism. So doing a lot of like our webinars, writing our Airflow Astronomer maintains an Airflow guide site with, sort of help for how to use open source Airflow. I maintain that site and write a lot of the content for it and things like that.
Nice. Oh, go ahead, Joe.
Well, I mean, in your experience working as a consultant, I mean, how much of that goes back and directly informs I guess the new code contributions into Airflow itself? Like, how tightly coupled is the project to what you're seeing? I guess what astronomers seeing on a day-to-day basis with this customer base.
Yeah, I mean, I would say vary. We get a lot of feedback from our customers, and on the field side, especially where we're talking to people who are, everything from existing customers to potential customers. We're hearing kind of every day what the pain points are with Airflow. And that feedback is all directed back to our internal Airflow team that is, again, working to drive the open source forward. So there's a pretty direct feedback mechanism there.
That's really cool. Matt, you had a question?
Yeah. I was going to ask you about serverless. And here's the context of this. Increasingly a pattern, it's getting a little bit technical, but I think even for people more on like the technology management side, they've probably heard of serverless. So the idea is that instead of using containers to deploy workloads and control them with Airflow, you actually use something like Cloud Functions or AWS Lambda. And then you have Airflow call that endpoint, runs for a few minutes, does whatever it needs to, feeds the data back to Airflow or dumps it into a bucket. And I've noticed like other orchestration tools like Data Coral are starting to push this pattern as well. Are you guys recommending this for customers? And do you think it will influence like the architecture and trajectory of Airflow in the future?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think we're hearing more and more about it. I would say, today the Astronomer platform itself, is designed to run on Kubernetes. So it itself is not serverless, but we do have customers that are running, again, Airflow to, trigger jobs elsewhere that are using serverless for that. And I think that works really well in a lot of cases and would expect that to expand. I can't speak to, I think, our, product roadmap itself and what the Astronomer platform will look like in terms of a, container-based or serverless in the future. But I do think that story, just with Airflow kind of integrating in with serverless, will get stronger over time.
It's funny, I was actually just writing a bit about the future of orchestration the other day, and I'll be curious to see where the Airflow roadmap goes. But I think one of the main pain points right now with managing serverless is just managing the functions themselves. In other words, you have to use the right runtime, and then you have to make sure the right version is deployed. There are just a lot of steps, and then you end up with like hundreds of functions inside your environment that you have to take care of. And so one thought I had, and we'll see if this happens, but is that some of like the build and infrastructure management workloads might get integrated into something like Airflow, where Airflow starts and it says, okay, I have the code in my environment for this function. Is it deployed? It checks if it's deployed. Okay, it's not deployed. So then it goes and deploys it, and then it calls it. And potentially that could get really interesting, because then we usually want to separate concerns, but I think in this case, bringing them together could really reduce that workload burden that we have right now.
Yeah, I think you're getting at kind of one of the, at least what I see as one of the main benefits of Airflow, especially when we're having conversations with, folks who might be using other orchestration tools and are sort of going, what's the benefit of Airflow? And like one of the things that I've always really liked about it is that like Airflow was designed to play with other tools. And so it naturally sort of gives you a point where you can bring everything together and manage it from one place. And obviously there's downsides like that you alluded to that as well. But I think, serverless is not going to be an exception to that, right? Where if you can integrate everything in, it's really nice to be able to, not be managing all of these disparate, services that are going on everywhere. That gets to be a lot.
I'd almost like to see Airflow become, let's call it an operating system for data. And by that, I mean, what does your operating system do? Well, it does things like interface with hardware, and it provides some basic functionality. But one of the main purposes of an operating system is just to manage services. So you have all these different services that you have to run. Like I have a MacBook, and so if you run PS and count the number of services, it's something like 300 processes, even if you're under very light load. And so in the future, I envision like maybe you'll have, say, an AWS or GCP account, and then Airflow will just kind of be the operating system for all your data pipelines to take care of all these bits and pieces. And like you said, managing code you need to interface with different APIs, to interface with different clouds, different databases and such.
Yeah, totally.
Interesting. What are some of the kind of taking a different tack real quick? What are some of the biggest anti-patterns you see with people and using Airflow?
Yeah, that's a good question. I almost hesitate to call this an anti-pattern because it's so common, but it's certainly not what Airflow was designed for. But I think, a lot of just people using only Python operators and processing like all of their data in Python, like within, their Airflow infrastructure. That's especially for newer Airflow users. That's just really, really common. We continue to see that. And while it can work for sort of smaller scale, I say this having like no judgment at all. Like I did this myself when I was implementing Airflow. I feel like it's just sort of a natural starting point, but it's not very scalable and you're not really taking advantage of a lot of Airflow's features. So that's probably the most common sort of anti-pattern that we see out there in terms of sort of difference between what Airflow was designed to do and what you can actually make it do.
Any others?
I'm trying to think of like what I've heard that, more than once. We talked to so many people that I've heard, I feel like every, type of Airflow story in terms of.
What's the craziest one you've heard of?
They're using it. Let's see, craziest. I have heard, I suppose this isn't like necessarily crazy per se, but it did sort of strike me as interesting, where I heard of, talked to a team that was using Azure Data Factory to trigger like their Airflow DAGs. So rather than using Airflow to like trigger other services and you could use it to trigger an Azure Data Factory, they were going the other way, which is, fine. Like you can trigger a DAG from the API externally. And if you want to manage it from ADF, like good for you. There's nothing wrong with it per se, just sort of an interesting, like, kind of flip of what you normally see Airflow used for.
That's really interesting. I guess one question I have is I see a lot of people are using DBT these days for transformations. And yet I see a lot of people using Airflow to trigger transformations as well. Do you have an opinion of should people do transformations within Airflow? Should they trigger DBT with Airflow? Do you have an opinion on this type of workflow?
Yeah. So I would say in general, we try to recommend as best practice, as often as possible to not use Airflow as your transformation framework, mostly because that's not really what it was designed to do. And again, you can, in a lot of cases, you have obviously some processing power available to you just by nature of running Airflow, and you could design all of it in Python, but it's meant more to be that orchestrator where the work is actually happening elsewhere. Airflow is just managing all of it. Because of that, I think in the DBT case, I would probably lean towards, recommending that people, run their transformations in DBT and again, just orchestrate it with Airflow. That's something that we've seen quite frequently and I think are seeing more and more as those two tools used together. Right now, it can be a little complex to set up just as the integration between Airflow and DBT, but there are a couple of ways that you can do that. And I think that will also get stronger over time as sort of more people from the community go, this isn't the easiest, let's figure out some better way to do this.
All right, what are your thoughts, Matt?
Yeah, let me go back to anti-patterns. So, and this is probably an anti-pattern you've seen too. One of the most common anti-patterns that I've seen is that if people are moving into Airflow, they don't use the metadata for tasks. So for example, they use current time in Python rather than figuring out what the official task time is. Yeah, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And I think one thing actually that just happened with the most recent release of Airflow was a change in something called execution date, which perpetually confuses everyone who ever touches it. Every time I teach Airflow, I have to explain execution date, and people still don't get it. So what's the change? Maybe you could just explain how the rename makes it easier for users to understand what's going on.
Yeah, for sure. So this was a release in Airflow 2.2, which just came out a week or two ago. And I will first, I guess, agree with that anti-pattern. We see that all the time, and it just sort of makes me cringe every time. That kind of lack of idempotency can really bite you if you've designed your DAGs that way. But yeah, in terms of the date and scheduling, so this was one of the kind of two main new features in Airflow 2.2 was a change in the way that I should say, an introduction of this concept of timetables, which kind of changes how Airflow schedules work under the hood. And so part of the motivation for doing that was, prior to this, to actually schedule your DAG, you had to provide either a cron expression or a time delta. And that's just inherently limiting. There are some schedules that you can't really express in a cron expression, like I don't want my DAG to run on holidays or, things like that. It's like, well, you're out of luck. You have to have multiple copies or whatever. So now with timetables, you can actually define your own schedules in Python code. So you can write whatever you want, which is really exciting. It makes it way more flexible. With that, kind of as they were implementing timetables, they did made a couple of changes in the terminology around, scheduling and execution date. As you said, execution date was a universally confusing concept. I think every single person struggles with it when they first started. So what they have now instead of this execution date is the concept of a data interval, which so each DAG run has a start and end to the data interval that it's going to operate on. So your data intervals might be, back to back and sort of shifting like this. You could also have holes in them depending on your schedule, so much more flexibility there. And again, that's representing more from sort of a ELT type or ETL type framework, the time period of data that DAG run is operating on. They have replaced the concept of execution date with what's now called logical date, which is still going to be the start of the data interval. So it's not the time that the DAG actually runs, but by changing it to logical date, it's hopefully a little less confusing to people. So they're not thinking, oh, this DAG actually runs at this time. And the other big change is now in the Airflow UI, when you're looking at your DAG schedule, there's this concept of run after, which is the date that the DAG will actually be triggered, or as soon after that date as possible, depending on kind of what's going on in your scheduler. So it's much easier now to kind of look at the Airflow UI and say, when is this DAG actually going to run and what period of data is it going to operate on? That information is all exposed there.
Yeah, this is fantastic. I mean, the thing is, you use this term data interval, and like you talk to any data person, any data engineer, any ETL developer, and they'll get what you mean immediately. Like you don't even have to explain it. They maybe have never heard that term before, but like, Joe, you haven't worked as much with Airflow, but you listen to this data interval. Oh yeah, I totally know what that is. Like you completely understand implicitly. Yeah, that's such a big improvement. Kind of looping back to the topic of getting into the framework and learning how it works. What would you recommend if a data scientist or a data engineer is interested in Airflow? They've seen people use it. They want to get some things up and running. What are their next steps? Like, how should they attack this problem? How should they avoid tech debt? How should they avoid bad systems setups that are going to come back to bite them?
Yeah, I would say, I guess kind of two ways of attacking that. One, I would say, like, if you're a new user to Airflow and depending on whether you have to deal with just the data engineering piece or actually running Airflow or both in a lot of cases, I think really understanding like the Airflow concepts, both from the DAG side and from the like Airflow component side, like what is actually running, having a good understanding of those to get started, I think will help you figure out, what am I actually going to need from this thing and how can I actually run it? when I need it to scale. So there's lots of resources out there for things like that. Astronomer provides a ton of them, both through, both like free from, again, like our guides. And we do intro to Airflow webinars quite frequently. I did one literally yesterday. Our Airflow certifications are another good way to get started, where you can actually take like a full course. And then if you want to take the exam at the end and kind of get the little badge, you can do that. That's a great place to start. From more of an infrastructure standpoint, I would say, I feel like I think about this, from a consultant standpoint, a lot of times, where I would say, understand kind of what your team is like as well. Like, are you going to manage this whole thing? Is it just going to be you? Do you have a DevOps team that's going to help you, that, can help run things and help you set it up? What does that kind of look like, to at least make that initial decision of, can I do this myself, or should I be looking for help kind of right away? From a basic sense, we would always recommend, using like, even if it's not managed Airflow, like managed cloud services for your infrastructure. Don't run Airflow on your laptop for anything other than testing. You're going to have
even on a single EC2, it's bad.
Yeah. Don't do that. It's not going to work out well for you. We've talked to plenty of customers that have set things up on a single EC2 instance, and it works for the first like 10 DAGs, and then they're like, well, we've reached the end of this road pretty quickly.
That's interesting. What happens in that case? Just to let the audience know, if you're trying to run it on a single server, say, like what are some of the limitations that come up?
Yeah, I mean, probably the big and most obvious one is that you have limited resources available to you. So your scalability is going to be really small, which maybe is fine for some teams, but lots of teams have, like a lot of data and a lot of DAGs that they're managing. So you need to know that Airflow is going to be able to kind of scale up to meet that demand when you have it. The other thing is that if you install, all of Airflow on a single EC2 instance, you're going to have a single point of failure, right? If that instance goes down, like your SOL, and that's not what you want if it's all of your data pipelines, right? Those are usually pretty important for organizations. So having, setting things up with high availability in mind is just really important.
Let me ask you this too. Suppose we're talking to, say, they're data team managers. So suppose they run data warehousing, or they're over a big data team. They're semi-technical, but they're not the engineer. They're not in there writing code. They understand the major technical issues of data. And they're looking at Airflow. They're looking at a couple of other options. Maybe they're using something like Control-M, a bit more legacy. How would you explain Airflow to them? And how would you explain the benefits? Like, how would you explain why they should switch from what they're doing now to Airflow?
Yeah. There's two ways that I think about that in terms of kind of the benefits of Airflow at a really high level. The first kind of goes back to what I said at the very beginning of, that tenet of pipelines as code. And even if you're not a technical person, I think it's, relatively easy to understand why that's a benefit. And we go through that a lot. Actually, the team that when I was a consultant, when I implemented Airflow, we moved them off of like a drag and drop-y kind of tool because of, it was really hard to manage changes. It was nearly impossible to, sort of share responsibilities across a team, much less multiple teams. Things like that. Like, there's a reason that, CI/CD kind of came to be predominant, and having, your data pipelines be able to integrate with that gives you just much more control and stability and a lot more flexibility. So I would say that kind of ties into the second point that I would say as a benefit of Airflow is that, from its core, it is designed to be an agnostic orchestrator, meaning that it can integrate with anything else you want. I mean, literally anything with an API, you can manage it with Airflow. So whereas a lot of those legacy tools are going to be very, much more limited in terms of their scope, either because that's what existed when they were designed, if they're legacy, or because they're much more tailored towards, people who are only using a certain cloud or only using this tech stack. So Airflow if you implement it today and, 3 months from now, your organization says, oh, we have this new business need and we need a new stack that is going to help manage that, you're not going to be in a position where all of a sudden your orchestrator doesn't play well with that tool. And now what do you do? With Airflow, it's just going to be really easy to integrate all of that in. So I think you're setting yourself up for success kind of in the long term.
Yeah, that's often how I explain Airflow. Like you said, it's not designed to control a database or even to move data. It's designed to interface with APIs, which means that you can, in the same platform, potentially interface even with several clouds and with several cloud managed services like Snowflake or BigQuery or something. It's kind of like orchestration is not a new concept, but I feel like it's just becoming more and more important now that where data engineers, instead of just dealing with one database, might be dealing, like you read the Netflix blog posts about their engineering team and the number of different database types and data lakes they have. That's what Airflow is for, basically.
I guess on that note, though, how do you prevent bloat in Airflow? What are some practices that you'd recommend?
Yeah, and I guess when you say bloat, do you mean more kind of just like in the number of DAGs and what they're doing?
Yeah, like DAG sprawl. Let's start with that. So,
yeah, that's a good question. I think, one thing comes to mind is keeping things, this is sort of similar with kind of falling into that software engineering general best practices, like keeping projects more isolated. And, one of the things that the Astronomer platform kind of seeks to do is, again, not make it so that because of architectural or infrastructure requirements, you have like a single Airflow instance that has to do everything. Like, don't put all of your DAGs in that one Airflow basket. Like, split things up into different Airflows. Like, make sure each team can have their own environment that they use and manage. That's just, one way to kind of prevent like a noisy neighbor sort of problem where you've got just way too much going on in one environment. And that just comes down to, again, how you deploy Airflow and manage it. Yeah, I think the rest of it, at least from my perspective, would come down to kind of how you manage your teams and like put controls on things and like how you're developing your pipelines and going, having a good deployment and kind of developer process in place so that things are reviewed and you don't have, everybody just sending random DAGs off to production. I think DAG design certainly comes into that as well. Are you putting everything? There's often a happy medium, between having like 1,000 DAGs that do sort of related things, but slightly different, and having one DAG that does all of those 1,000 things, right? So those.
Does Astronomer have an official recommendation on that?
No, not from that perspective in terms of like how much stuff you put in a single DAG, because I think it varies so much based on the use case. Our best practice recommendations would tend to be around, sort of general data engineering best practices. So like keep your tasks themselves atomic. So each task should only do a single unit of work, which is obviously just going to help if something goes wrong, or, debugging and all of that stuff. But yeah, in terms of and keeping your DAGs idempotent, so that can come into the design as well. But past that, I think it is just hard to say as like a most general that there's like a happy. Yeah. I think in general there's a happy medium, but what that is probably going to depend a lot and have a big range.
Yeah, seems like it. Interesting. Back to the Astronomer platform. I mean, how do you get started using it?
Yeah, so the easiest way is to reach out to us. We have a form on our website you can fill out and we'll chat with you. Astronomer has a couple of different products. So same essential platform, but different ways of interacting with it. So like our enterprise platform gets deployed into the customer's environment. So on a Kubernetes cluster that they would host themselves. We obviously help with like the installation and all of that, but it is self-hosted in that sense. So for those customers, we would usually work with them initially to figure out, make sure that was the right fit and then if they wanted to move forward, we would help them install it, and then they're sort of off and running, but Astronomer has no access to it. We also have a managed solution. So that's our Astronomer Cloud. And so that's going to be, everything managed by Astronomer, and you just interact with it. So those work, lots of customers use both. But I would say the initial conversations are us just figuring out kind of which method is going to be best for them and then getting them moving forward.
Interesting. I guess what's the fine line between that, though? I mean, because it seems like having a Kubernetes running presents its own challenges for certain teams. So
yeah, it definitely can, and I would say that's one of the reasons that folks choose to go with our cloud is because they don't want to manage Kubernetes, and that's just not going to work well for them. And again, that's why we developed a managed service, because we know that's the case for a lot of folks. Kind of the flip side is, sometimes organizations either are already using Kubernetes and they have that experience in-house and they want everything, kind of in one place. And the other sort of benefit to the enterprise platform overall is that because it's, self-hosted and it's completely isolated within your environment, you have a lot more customizability sort of over different aspects of it. So for some of the, larger, more whale-like companies, that can be a good thing. But yeah, like I said, we have tons of customers on both. So.
Interesting. And what's pricing like?
Yeah, I'm to be totally honest with you, not the one who deals with pricing conversations. So I would say, yeah, reach out to us. We do kind of annual licensing subscriptions, if that's helpful.
Just asking for the audience. Pricing is one of the questions that inevitably comes up. So
yeah. We always deflect those to our sales team. They manage those conversations.
That's cool. Interesting. Do you have like a sandbox version people could try out too?
So on our cloud product, we do have the concept of a trial. So I think you have to reach out to us to get set up with it. Of course, we route everything through the sales team. But that is a way that sometimes folks will, kind of try out the product. So no, we don't have a, just sort of open sandbox right now that, some other, is I think what you were getting at, some other companies have, at least at this point, but there are ways that you can kind of try it out.
Cool.
And yeah, I guess something I'd like to talk to your sales team about is just kind of pay-as-you-go pricing. To what extent could we bring in a new client, say, all right, let's try this out. It's going to be really cheap when you start out and you have 3 DAGs running, and then it's going to scale up from there. It's kind of what you can do with Cloud Composer. The model may be a bit different. So yeah.
Yeah, we definitely, I think, pricing is something that we have a couple of different models for, specifically for that reason, because there are, that is something that we hear a lot. Folks are just getting started and they want something that's going to scale with them in terms of that. So the very vague answer is that we can always work with people to.
Oh, okay. That's fantastic. That's a great thing to hear. So,
yeah.
Again, we have some potential customers for you guys. So who will be starting small. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, cool. I guess for people who want to know more about Astronomer, how would they find out more information?
Yeah, I would say on our website, there's I think it's astronomer.io/getastronomer. Maybe there's a form you can fill out that will get you in contact with somebody from our field team or sales team. People can, always reach out to me directly. I'm just Kenten at astronomer.io for anybody listening. I'm happy to kind of direct those conversations. Our website has a lot of information both about the products and, links to those other kind of resources that I've talked about that are just there and available for everybody, the webinars, guides, things like that. So that's really the best place to get started.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, looking forward to more of your webinars and public facing stuff. So I checked some of it out yesterday and I was like, oh yeah, she knows her stuff. So it's awesome. Well, cool. Well, Kenten, it's been fun. Thanks for hopping on the Joe and Friends show. So, and thanks to Astronomer Again, shout out, really good company. So check them out if you're interested in orchestration. So
Yeah, thanks for having me.
of course. All right. Oh, and also before I forget, if you have not subscribed to our YouTube, go to Ternary Data, subscribe to that, smash the like button on all of our videos. This video will also be, it's also being streamed, so it'll be saved afterward. Subscribe to our newsletter at ternarydata.com. We got a lot of cool content coming out. Yeah, and stay tuned for next week, Monday morning data chat. We have Al Bellamy, he's going to be on. And next week for Joe and Friends show, we have Maroxa. So this is going to be fun. My friend Devaris Brown's going to be on talking about his game-changing change data capture streaming solutions. So stay tuned for that. Anyway, cool. Okay, it's been fun. We'll talk to you soon. So have a good one.
Sounds
All right,
good.
take care.
Thanks,
Bye.
guys.